find their way there once a year. But I'm going to kick it off, everyone, because believe it or not, it's already a few minutes after 7. My name's Alexandra Vanderkamp, and I'm the executive director of Gemini Inc. This is the Big Texas Read, and it began as a solution to how to bring readers and writers together in the beginning of the pandemic. It was actually a brainchild of the novelist David Samuel Levinson and the amazing Blake Kimsey, who's the executive director of Writing Workshops Dallas. I'm kind of Blake tonight, everyone. I mean, who could not be with us tonight, but it was a way to bring writers and readers together when we couldn't meet in person. Well, it's gotten its own legs, and we've been doing this for 2.5 years. So we're pretty psyched to be bringing this to you again tonight. Gemini Inc., if you don't know, is San Antonio's Writing Arts Center. I'm going to be hosting this with our Director of Programs, Florinda Flores Brown. Our mission is to teach the craft of writing to people of all skill levels so they can bring their stories to life. So we have year-round writing workshops, and then another thing we do is author events. We love to bring readers and writers together in new, innovative ways and create great literary community. So that's what the Big Texas Read is all about. So I want to do a shout out just to a few of our sponsors. UTSA Libraries, Lone Star Literary is great at promoting us. The Twig Bookstore in San Antonio, Interrobang Books in Dallas. And thanks to a Humanities Texas grant, we're actually able to give our very talented authors and featured moderators a little bit of an honoraria, which we're kind of psyched about. And we're very thrilled to be bringing you Daniel Pena tonight with his novel Bang. And we have a wonderful featured moderator, Dr. Ulises Pina, who's come all the way from Long Beach, California. And I think they're going to conduct a heck of a conversation for us about the writing process in this very interesting novel. Just to give you a few housekeeping details, we ask you to mute yourself if you're not actually actively asking a question, which would possibly happen in the last portion of the night in the audience Q&A. We are going to have Daniel read just briefly from his novel. Then we'll have this great author conversation with him and Dr. Pena. And that wraps up at about 8. And then after that, for 10 or 15 minutes, we open it up to the audience to ask questions to Daniel. So leave your questions in the chat, and Florinda will be looking through those, and I'm asking some of them to Daniel at the very end. Use the chat. That's literary community too. Leave questions. Share your comments about Daniel's work. Tell us where you're Zooming from. We'd love to have an active chat. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand this over to Florinda Flores Brown. She's our great director of programs, and she's going to introduce our featured author and moderator.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexandra. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm excited to hear these two folks share about their work and have a conversation about Daniel's really amazing book. So Daniel Pena is a pushcart prize-winning writer and assistant professor. Formerly, he was based out of UNAM in Mexico City, where he worked as Fulbright Garcia Robles Scholar, a graduate of Cornell University and a former Picador guest professor in Leipzig, I don't know if I said that right, Germany. His writing has appeared in Ploughshares, The Rumpus, The Kenyan Review, Texas Monthly, NBC News, and the New York Times Magazine. He's currently a regular contributor to The Guardian and Ploughshares blog. His novel Bang is out now from Arte Publico Press. He lives in the beautiful Dallas-Fort Worth area, but does sometimes come to San Antonio. Ulises Pena, PhD, your Pina and Pena, it gets a little confusing. Ulises Pina, PhD, is an assistant professor of history at California State University, Long Beach, specializing in the history of Mexico and modern Latin America. A product of the California public school system, his teaching and research interests include revolutions, social movements, state formation studies, political culture, and social activism. Currently, he is revising a book manuscript tentatively titled Rebellious Citizens under advanced contract with Stanford University Press. He is also a longtime supporter of the Los Angeles Galaxy. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. All right, so should I just go ahead and take it away? All right, yeah, we did that to confuse you. We did Pena back to back. We were actually, this is the real story. This is how we met, was me and Dr. Pena we were both Fulbrighters in Mexico City. And they sat us down next to each other on the bus because we were just one letter off. And then that's how we became friends. And then like we just have been exchanging work and stuff ever since. What was that?
Must have been about 100 degrees that day, right?
100 degrees and you were wearing a tweed sweater or a jacket.
Tweed jacket. Yeah.
A tweed jacket.
I think I was drenched in sweat, but that's how we first met.
Yeah. Well, we look sharp.
We did.
We look sharp on that bus. I'm really grateful here. This is like a really special thing for me. Not only because it's, you know, these great organizations, Gemini Inc. and you know, the writers workshops in Dallas, but it's sort of like this connective tissue between these that I'm really familiar with. And I have a lot of family in both of them. I'm going to start with this scene from the chapter Safe Home in Bang. I'll read for just a little bit, and I'm just excited to talk with Dr. Pina, and we'll get right into it. Cool. This is on page 200 if you guys have the book. It's at the very bottom, and it starts with Cuauhtemoc purges it all from his mind. To set this up, Cuauhtemoc has just landed on an unbelievably heavy plane. He knows that the cartel in which he's been involved with knows that they know that he knows that they know that he has embezzled money, basically to try to get out of that life. And there's this moment in which he's arriving to the safe home and he's freaking out. And he's trying to strategize, how is it that I get out of this mess? And this takes place in San Miguel, which is loosely based on a real town called Praxedes de Guerrero in Juarez Valley. But it starts with Cuauhtemoc purges. Cuauhtemoc purges it all from his mind before his boot even touches the ground. He forgets the bloody road leading up to San Miguel. He forgets the private strip in Sweetwater, Texas, called Fraley, where he made his drop of cocaine. He purges his memory of looking down on Interstate 20, running east of El Paso, those burning cars, hot, greasy diesel smoke pouring black up into a plume that screened out the sun and wispy in shadows of smoke. That familiar burnt orange Ford Lobo, the one he'd ridden in so many times before from the airstrip, gushing from the undercarriage, blood and oil and gasoline out from the driver, wearing purple boots. Cuauhtemoc knew, even from the sky, who those boots belonged to. He purged his mind too. He plants his foot on the running boards of the white Dodge Durango at the end of the Nahuatl Street and climbs into the passenger seat. Any peculiarities, the driver asks him, cracking his spearmint gum. Cuauhtemoc glosses him over. They've never met before. No, he says. Cuauhtemoc keeps a stolid face, but his hands give him away, his finger pulling at the long, puckered scar on his left arm, where it was cut the night he was deported from Texas, the night he was kidnapped and forced to fly the cartel planes. Cuauhtemoc says nothing as he eases his body into the passenger seat of the car. He turns down the radio and clicks it to the AM band. Texas high school football, Westlake versus Copperas Cove. He takes the driver's Stetson from the dash and drapes it over his sun-wearied eyes. I can't understand English, the driver says. I know, says Cuauhtemoc softly and lowers the brim. The engine turns over and the driver pulls out onto a side road. The driver expertly weaves through the boulders strewn pell-mell about the streets that keep the police from navigating the neighborhood and keep the military out too. Cuauhtemoc closes his eyes and feels his neck fuse with the sweat to the hot leather headrest. His mouth is dry. His bones are aching. The driver takes Cuauhtemoc the long way to the safe house, which looks like all the other safe houses in Ciudad Juarez. A squat, pale brown one, meandering cracks in the walls that split jagged in the cold months like sweeping bolts of lightning. Desert wasps make their home in the seams where the warmth escapes. They breed and die. They shred up with their lives until the house takes on the fragile look of a cracked egg, or like tempered glass about to shatter. Eases his aching body from the comfort of the pleather. He moves to turn off the radio, but it's already off. He walks around the fender and slaps the numbers tacked on the wall of the house just for kicks. 410. All of the safe houses end in 10. 2810, 510, 4510. Cuauhtemoc commits every safe home address he's tried to bring down with a slap of his palm to memory. I think that's a good place to stop. Yeah. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for letting me know.
I've known Daniel since about 8 years ago, right? As Daniel mentioned, we were both Fulbright scholars in Mexico City. So I've had the privilege of seeing this work develop from 2014, and you were already writing, the book in 2014 before that, and I've seen it through your experiences as a Fulbright scholar. This is a twofold question. First, what inspired you to write this book, right? Because it's a book with such heavy subject matter. And two, how did your year living in Mexico shape what the book eventually became?
Oh man, those are great questions. I mean, for the real sort of root of the book was this meditation on dignity. Like, what is dignity? Where does it come from? And is it a right or is it a privilege? And it's something we don't talk about within the context of things like the drug war, or things like immigration. But I was fascinated on sort of an extended meditation of how the drug war, US immigration policy, and like late capitalism, at that time, what we would have said neoliberal capitalism, right? NAFTA and all that, how those things sort of supported each other and reinforced each other and created this sort of like vicious machine. And it was a fact at that time that so many of the people who were being absorbed into the statistics of the drug war. I mean, in 2014, the really macabre statistic was, I think, 140,000 dead. More than 80 journalists disappeared, and a lot of them were, not the vast majority, but a significant chunk of them were people who we had deported from the United States. And so the big driving question of this book was like, and sort of, the sort of the nascent sort of vibe of it was, are these systems designed or on purpose? And if on purpose, what does that say about us that we keep feeding money and bodies and resources to it, to keep sort of like churning through bodies? And so now really grim, because you're looking at these very grim sort of like case studies, right? As for the year of living in Mexico, sorry, I just got over COVID not too long ago, and so I cough a lot. But I think that year in Mexico really shed light on the underpinnings of how the Mexican government at that time, certain Mexican administrations, when we were there, was under Enrique Peña Nieto, who we now know today. I mean, he's kind of an exile. He lives in Spain. His attorney general, Jesus Caram, was just arrested because of the corruption charges that the government was collaborating with certain cartel elements that helped disappear 43 students. And so it was an impolite truth that, there were certain elements of El Estado that were like sort of like heavily involved in collaborating with narcos. And so for me, to be there at that time was like, wow, it was just laid bare, and it was like a powder keg, And so we couldn't help. There was a while, I remember, months, where we just kind of, I was working, but we were kind of also taking a step back to look at like, what is this historical artifact? As Alan Crapo, the visual artist, would say, that he would call it a happening. What is this happening? This thing that just happened, and what is the fallout?
One of the things that I like about your novel, and that students actually like about it too, because I've taught this in the classroom, is that it reminds us that ordinary people also play a large part in history, right?
Yeah.
Agents, that they go through, they struggle daily life. They struggle to live a dignified life, right? In a society that perhaps has experienced unimaginable trauma, terror, and even heartbreak, right? What was the writing process for that? How did you think about being able to channel terror, trauma, and heartbreak in the characters that you developed?
Yeah. I mean, so much of it is going back to that sort of like, I'm a huge believer that a character has to change from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. And the ways in which they change is the story, And so for these characters, I think of them going up against these really terrible and terrifying things. And for me, the least interesting part of the story was like the macabre details. I remember working with specific editors on different sections of this book, Can you guys hear my kid in the background? By the way? He's like, ah. I remember working on different aspects of this book, and people saying, you know, I want to know the details of X, Y, and Z. I remember at the very end was there was a car bomb, right? To spoil it, but it was one of the, that happens. That doesn't really happen in Mexico. You see that happening in Ireland, like during the Troubles. You would see it happening in various parts of say Afghanistan, right during the in there. But it was not a very sort of like Mexican style or cartel style. But remember, there was a specific bit of the book where everyone was like, I want more of that. I was like, that's the least interesting part of it. The most interesting part of it is how do you maintain dignity and how do you stay human amidst all of that, you know? And so for me, like the writing process was always going back to these very simple things, asking what does these characters want within this scene? What do the characters want? And there are big macro wants, right? To be reunited within the narrative. But then there are small things too, right? Araceli is my favorite character in the novel, where all she wants is like, for a while, it's like a cigarette, right? These tiny little things. And she makes these like little corn husk cigarettes. And then all she wants is to sort of quench her thirst. All she wants is to, and you know, for most of us, we're like, I love that you grounded this in this idea of like ordinary people living ordinary lives amidst historical circumstances. That's kind of what this is, you know, it's people who are trying their best amidst crazy stuff, you know, and frankly, stuff that's of what, like these geopolitical things that are basically, it's all money. It's all late capitalism, you know.
Another thing that I like about the novel is that, as you just mentioned, right, this is a story about the human cost of the drug war in Mexico. The story that goes beyond the stereotypes that cater to the white gaze, right? And that, you know, which continue to be popular mainstays of streaming.
Sure.
Did you go about challenging that perception of Mexico in the process, or is this something that came to you during your year of living in Mexico?
That's a great question. Oh man. Yeah. The stories are tough to write about because there's some really unfortunate truths to the drug war, like what happened in the Enrique Peña Nieto administration, like what happened in the midst of, and I hope Napa more broadly in a little bit, but these things where you almost, if you sidestep them, you sidestep some fundamental truth that could be articulated to nuance the conversation away from like stereotypes. I'm a huge believer in this fact that if you let a stereotype sit long enough, it becomes a fact, at least in the public imagination, which is actually a dangerous thing. And so I think we're in this moment right now, especially with writers of color, and it's really, I think it has some merit in which there is a huge emphasis on like writing, you know, Black joy, brown joy, and I think it's a worthy endeavor. And I don't take anything away from those writers, but I think when we write about the things that also ail our communities, the things that also ail our countries or countries of our parents, we neglect those really tough conversations, and we let those stereotypes sort of crystallize into something in the public imagination. And the fundamental truth of this book, I mean, really, this is what I was trying to do with characters like Cuauhtemoc, with characters like Araceli, was trying to write them away from like this stereotypical archetypical like narco, and into this thing is like, not everyone who falls the scary TV Reina del Sur like action person. You know, it's like a lot of these people are ordinary people under these really extraordinary circumstances who frankly got involved in and for many of them it was the only option. You know, for Cuauhtemoc in the book, he's kidnapped and he has a skill that the cartel can use. He's impressed into service. We know this happens with doctors, with various other people. For the character Lalo, you know, for instance, in the book sort of outlines that his family farm was hit really hard by NAFTA. You know, when US milk can undercut Mexican milk by $1, everyone's going to buy the Mexican milk. And so what do those Mexican farmers do? How do they earn a living? How do they provide for their family? And so Lalo has a kid. And so it's really easy and convenient for him to justify, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not doing anything bad. I'm just driving a truck from this side of the border to the other, no questions asked, and they pay me. I'm off free kind of thing. And obviously it gets complicated later, but, you know, and that's most of it. I think it's sort of, if anything, it really, I hope it demystifies the idea of like the nautical as like a boogeyman or something. I think they're manifestations of, frankly, like hypercapitalism. We don't think of the black market as a market, but it's a market in the way that market is, right? And it's sort of, I mean, this is the big truth I wanted to articulate with this book is like through these characters is that armies or in the market and these, you know, like Calderon's drug war, when those things come head to head, the market always wins, you know. The drugs will always find a way to find, right, if not drugs, then other things, right? I think that's one of the other big truths of this book is that the drugs, it's the portfolios of these cartels are so diverse now that it's not just drugs, right? It's software, it's human trafficking, it's everything, right? It's black market stuff in general. Yeah.
The brothers' stories in this book is just so fascinating, so interesting. What messages do you want to convey to the reader about their stories, about identity, about belonging, and about home?
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I always think of them as more American than Mexican, right? They're in like, you know, Praxedes G. Guerrero, they're in San Miguel, but they're still sort of rooting for the San Antonio Spurs. You know, they're not really, they bought into the idea of Mexico, but they're learning really quickly that Mexico hasn't bought into the idea of them. And so I think, who is it that used the term satellite Mexicans? They, you know, like Mexicanos de afuera, were like almost like Mexicanos like in orbit or something around it. And I think of them as in that way, in which they'll have things like, I put the pajarete in the book. Dr. Pino taught me what a pajarete was, which is just like, if I'm not mistaken, it's, what is it, like cup full of Nescafe, cup full of cane sugar, raicilla,
raicilla or sugarcane alcohol, whatever you have.
And then milk straight from the teat of a cow.
You can also light it, right? And it kind of creates like a flame and mode type of effect.
You can light it up. You can. It's like
you light it up
I didn't know that.
with the cow milk. You just put it off, right? And I think it's called the pajarete, right?
Pajarete, yeah. And there's a part in the book where actually, who's that guy? Ivan, the character who is sort of the hotel innkeeper, you know, is drinking a pajarete, or he's watching a guy make a pajarete sort of toward the beginning of the novel. But they know what these things are. They're just, you know, and so they have the taste, they have the cultural references, but you know, they're not quite Mexican. But I wanted to play with this idea of like being so close, you know, these sort of like these contact zones of the US and Mexico, but they're not quite at ease in either. And the United States hasn't bought into the idea of them either, you know? So there's this like thirdness, you know, to go back to Gloria's Aldo, this idea of like Nepantla. So it's kind of like a meditation on that. And then how do you exist within both fabrics? And the fundamental truth, which I think is like, they're two coins of the same kind of violence. This thirdness is like an artificial creation on both sides of the border.
One of the things that you mentioned some of your research process about what a planet is. And you know, I knew you in 2014-15 when you were writing this, and I know you actually went to the National Archive in Mexico City.
Yeah, you took me.
I did.
Yeah, you did.
And your knowledge on aviation is somewhat encyclopedic, right? Extremely detailed. Can you tell me about the research process that went into the book? How you came upon aviation, even the drug cartels, or just any ancillary random things that made it into the book and that helped shape it.
Yeah. So the aviation bits were from my life as a former pilot. My wife asked me to stop saying that I was a bad pilot, because I wasn't. I was a competent pilot, but I don't fly anymore. And so I always think of like, if you don't fly anymore, you know. But I was a pilot. I was training for a long time. I had an interview with Mexicana Airlines. This is like the story of my life. Things like this keep happening where I do everything right, right? And then you get to the interview stage, and Mexicana Airlines folded. And so I had all this training. I had like my license and everything. And the idea at that time is if you got 150 hours, if you were able to train for 150 hours on any aircraft, they would like train you from 150 to jet time. And then, through like a 6-month program, and then send you off. And then, there's a shortage of pilots at this time. The CEOs of that company embezzled a lot of money. From what I understand, they're still protesting at the airport today. If you go to like Terminal 2 at the Mexicano, the old terminal, they're still there. But anyway, that didn't work out. And so I became a writer, right? And then as I'm working on this book, right, it was so convenient just to have that sort of knowledge of my own training and like the character of Cuauhtemoc, but also the sort of like subjectivity of like, who are these guys as like Tejanos, like young Chicano Tejano dudes. They're kind of like my age, I guess our age, in set in like 2014, 2015. Oh no, it was actually set a little earlier, actually, if I'm not mistaken, like during the Calderon era, when all of the armies are heading north into Ciudad Juarez, and there's that sort of fighting between the sort of autodefensas and the military and the cartels that clustered during the Calderon administration. And so, I mean, so much of it was just like from personal experience, like the aviation stuff. Some of the more practical stuff, right? We talk about the AGN. Part of my job, as we were Fulbrighters, was going down to the UNAM. They have an incredible archive in Torre Dos on its Centro de Investigaciones sobre América Latina y el Caribe. And on that floor, they have a massive archive of just like straight up drug war documents and stuff. And actually, while we were there, I mean, we had a colleague, Dr. Eileen Teague, who was, I mean, her gallery got shut down, right? She was studying the drug war. And so, Dr. Teague was a huge resource, as were a lot of journalists who were working there at the time, right? Alfredo Corchado, who wrote like the seminal book, Midnight in Mexico. I met him when I was there. And he was actually one of the first guys who, after Ayotzinapa happened, like we unpacked that, and he was sort of giving me the lay of the land about basically how the Calderon administration ended and what the new sexennial for Peña Nieto was and what his thoughts on it were. And so for me, that was a huge way in which I could wrap my mind around not only the happening of the drug war and the sort of the statistics of it, but also in which that sort of macro floats down into the characters. One of my favorite quotes is from Tayari Jones, where she says, we never want to write about problems and their people. We never want to write macro down. And I think in Mexico, I was very conscious of that, like, making sure I did, my due diligence, but also making sure that I wasn't writing a story as if they were like cardboard cutouts or something. They were always writing about people and their problems. As you would say, sort of ordinary people stuck in extraordinary circumstances who make history or something like that. Yeah. But yeah, as a rookie writer, that was the struggle. That was the homework. Yeah.
I'm recalling 2014. Just Ayotzinapa and the 43 students that were disappeared was, I mean, me personally, it's left a profound impact, right? It shaped, not only my worldview, but also like the way I approach my scholarship, the stories that I decide to tell, how I decide to tell them. I like that you said problems and their people, right?
Yeah.
How has this manifested in, not just in Bang, but in other works that you've produced?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, right now I'm writing a piece on mass shootings. Actually, I'm looking at the statistics of that. It's a nonfiction piece on mass shootings, and it's weird. The impulse there is to look at the macro phenomenon of that, and just sort of boil it down into sort of like some broad scope and say all these people belong to the same thing. But really, what it is, and I sort of posit this in the book, is that, like, I make the argument that I actually believe that violence, and it's kind of like a state-sponsored violence by allowing us to have so many weapons are there, it's a way of ensconcing a two-tiered citizenship. People who are willing and able to sort of use the power of the weapon to take that power into their own hands, and the rest of us, basically, right? And so it primarily affects, right, a lot of these shootings are white supremacist shootings. And so there's this sort of tendency, it's creepy to sort of see the rhetoric of like the Patriot movement, all this stuff, the history sort of repeated in these manifestos. And it's apparent that this two-tiered citizenship is made possible by virtue of this weapon. Anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying you can always rest at that macro level and make it in that way. But for me, the most familiar, or the easiest way, or the easiest aperture into that material is actually through the individual. you know. In a piece I write about, I was never in a mass shooting, but I was almost in two. One in New Jersey in 2013, and one actually right after we got back from Mexico City. There was a guy, John Hauser, who came into the movie theater I was in, got into an argument with someone, and was quickly ushered out, and then shot up the next week, movie theater in Lafayette. And so me processing sort of like, what the fuck was that? And he had this whole manifesto he laid out. But this is neither here nor there. It was, for me, the most nutritional value from that story was and I didn't know this until the second, third draft, was like my own subjective experience of that. You know, what did it feel like to be in the theater with that guy? What does it feel like to be in the theater? That guy did that thing. And what are my own experiences within the American fabric, you know? And for me, that's the more powerful and the more interesting story, because otherwise we're creating propaganda, actually. You know, like literature should always be, I think, rooted in a kind of the exploration of what it means to be human, you know? And so for me, it's like, that's always the homework, is motion toward the macro, but from a very subjective experience, you know?
I'm going to return a little bit back to the heart of the book.
Yeah.
Mexican motherhood and womanhood play such a central role in your book. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about Mexican motherhood and womanhood.
Yeah. I mean, Araceli is my favorite character in this book. I mean, so much of the truth of her character is that she's facilitating the closure of like what these systems have broken apart, right? And so for me, she's like a reflection of, I mean, you see women, you see this in Ciudad Juarez, you saw it in, you know, the dirty wars in Argentina, you saw this under Pinochet's regime, that it's always mothers, it's always sisters who are basically holding these bad doers accountable, right? Who are trying to find closure, and that emotional labor is not cheap or free, you know? But they're always kind of the ones who are demanding justice. And for me, those characters were like a meditation on that, was an articulation of how, if there is any justice in this drug war, if there's any justice in sort of finding answers or finding some sort of like accountability, you know, it's always the mothers who are protesting, the mothers who are at the police sites asking for more information, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, but it was a real unpacking of that labor and what that labor means.
The book was published in 2018. I feel like it's a new world, right? We lived, you know, anybody that's been alive during this period, it's just radically transformed your outlook again, right?
Yeah.
When you go back and think about Bang, how has your understanding of that book in the process and what it eventually became, what do you think about now today?
Yeah, in some ways I still think it's relevant. In other ways I think it's a new world. Something that Samantha Schweblin, I was in Berlin for the first part of the pandemic, and I saw Samantha Schweblin's book 100 Eyes in German. It was 100 Augen, had come out. I went to the book launch, and she gave a presentation. She said something that I will never forget, where she that just happened pandemic. She called it a real like golpe. She's like, it was a real, or a choque or something like that. She said, it's the before times and the after times. And the unfortunate thing for literature is we that didn't know what the future needed. And so I think about that, like, oh man, like she's like, there's so much of our literature that isn't speaking toward the present moment, and other books from the past that were written that speak to this moment like incredibly. But yeah, I think my book was about a very specific time in Mexico, right? It was about the sexenio of Calderón, the sexenio of Peña Nieto. And if there's any cold comfort, it's that Peña Nieto is on the run, right? He's in Spain, they're looking for him, right? That Jesus Caram, the guy who said, you know, ya me cansé, you know, that I'm tired of sort of having to, trying to shut down the press conference, journalists were asking him about the details, about the Cocula dump and about all these things in Oitinapa. You know, there was a while, I think there was a period where in Mexico, you saw the worst of like the dirty wars come back to like have a reprisal. And I mean, I have my thoughts on Andres Manuel. I mean, he's no saint, but it is heartening to see the accountability there. Those characters like Cienfuegos, the general who was the head of the military, the general, like the general, being arrested. I think now running for office again. Jesus Caram being arrested. And that's Enrique Peña Nieto on the run. That they didn't get away with it, right? They're even Calderon, who I think went in with the best of intentions, but sort of like destabilized entire regions of Mexico. They're able to, that legacy is marred in a way that's different. But yeah, I do think it's a very specific time in history. And I'm actually, I think about this a lot where I'm like, when you write a book and you finish it, I'm like, man, I'm glad to kind of let that go, because I had so much anger. You remember me in Mexico in like 2014? There's just like so much anger about like the impunity that people could just do stuff and get away with it. I think a lot of Mexicans had it. It was a powder keg that year. Like people were in the streets. I'll never forget the riot on Reforma. It's like an actual riot. This is like right when they were, the Mexican government, this is Enrique Peña Nieto's government, was manipulating the hashtags on Twitter. So people were using it to organize, to say, use this street, don't use this street. And that's how it came out that they were, using Israeli spy equipment to game the hashtags. And they had these things called Peña bots, where they had like thousands of government Twitter bots where they could spam a hashtag and then make it drop on the list, right? So they would game Twitter's algorithm to diminish or diffuse dissent online. And I don't know, it is good to know that, like, I don't think this book was like a seminal book in helping dismantle that, but I do think it played some tiny little grain of being like, fuck this shit, you know what I mean? Like, like sort of like raging against the machine a little bit. As for that, I'm hardened. I don't know.
I want to go back to the characters, the ordinary people in this novel who are faced with these impossible moral choices. I'm also thinking about the journalists in Mexico that you mentioned. You mentioned a statistic: 80 journalists were assassinated in that.
At that time, yeah, it's grown now to the hundreds, 100 plus.
I'm also reminded of Javier Valdez Cardenas's book, The Taken, which has been translated into English as The Taken, about Levantones. And I'm wondering, how much did the plight of journalists influence your process as well?
Oh man, like a lot. I mean, I remember you were someone who I reached out to when I had written that piece for The Guardian. For those who don't know, I had written for The Guardian quite a bit, opinion. And the backstory is that there were 3 or 4 Mexican citizens who died in Egypt after the Egyptian government mistook them for terrorists and ordered an airstrike on them. Enrique Peña Nieto demanded a full investigation and accountability of the Egyptian government. And being the troll that I was, I wrote in The Guardian, I said, you have no right to ask for full accountability and the truth until we know what you did with the 43 students. You tell us what happened to our 43 Mexican students and our 43 citizens, right? And it actually, it went a little mini viral. There were political cartoons that were created about it. Jeremy Corbyn had written like a letter to the ambassador of Mexico to the United Kingdom, which was like a huge deal. He was the minority leader for Labor in the House of Parliament at the time. And then actually, this is the craziest thing, was he actually ended up taking out, in the UK, if you write something about you, they have these like libel laws that you can take out an entire page to respond to it. So if someone accuses you of something, you can write back. And so usually with op-ed, they just let it go, but the Mexican government actually responded. And then shortly thereafter, I got like almost like mini docs. Do you remember? I had like all these like weird Twitter bots and all these weird things sending me YouTube videos of like, I won't even mention them, but frankly, just really violent stuff, right? Links to videos of pretty savage cartel killings, and these sort of implicit threats like this is going to happen to you. And I couldn't prove, like, that was the frustrating thing. I couldn't prove that these were organized later, but like later we came out to know that the Peña Nieto government would do this to journalists. They would send out their like bot army, and it was a way in which they could put a freezing effect on that journalist, say, you should not write about this anymore. but also uses like, you know, stymie dissent really. And this was right in the midst of Nadia Vera and Ruben Espinosa, who Francisco Goldman had taken like a 5,000 New Yorker about them, their life, their work, but also their killing, right? And there were people who, again, nobody could quite prove that the Mexican government had done it, but they were huge critics of the Enrique Peña Nieto administration. And it's just a frustrating thing, is because, you know, you have these, you know, people who we know. Alfredo Corchado was another one of them. It wasn't ordered by the Mexican government; it was ordered by the cartel. But people who were dissenting or who were writing, you know, real reportage, real high stakes stuff, doing really important work to the ends of, like, you know, revealing human rights violations. When we first got to Mexico, I think La Playa, that there was like a massacre right when we got there. So like doing this important, who were just disappearing, and it was endlessly frustrating to sort of try to articulate this to an American audience who was looking like, don't say bad things about Mexico, and you're like, yeah, I agree, but also like, you know, like these are real things, and these are real, like, human rights violations that we should look at them, and they're worthy of our cause, and not only worthy of our sort of concentration, but I think worthy of literature, right? I think that's been the most frustrating thing with Bang is I think it's been, I think sometimes people have taken it as sort of this exploration of sort of like things that, like, I'm running PR for Mexico or something. Like you shouldn't, don't talk bad about it. I'm Mexican, right? I have Mexican citizenship. My mom is Mexican, and, you know, but I do feel like it's part of, it's not Mexico actually, but I think of it as like hypercapitalism, frankly, the ways in which money moves, the dedazo moves power, moves a lot of things. And it's a bigger story, but, you know, frankly, everything that happened after 1994, you know, Colosio gets killed, the devaluation of the peso, all that stuff, NAFTA.
I teach Daniel's book in my History of Mexico class, and this is a class that, you know, covers 500 years of history, right, from pre-conquest to the present day, and part of the class focuses on the drug war. And Daniel's book is one of the books that I assigned for this course, and I'm going to actually read you, Daniel, what one of my students said about your book. I appreciate Daniel's honesty, sincerity, and unflinching take on the subject matter. It is admittedly difficult not to conjure up the images of intense violence and brutality about Mexico that is usually depicted by both popular media and news outlets. But the novel does much in the way of avoiding that approach to addressing the subject of the drug war. Can you just expand upon sort of what hearing a student reflection about your novel,
Yeah,
does that make you feel about the impact that you're having?
it makes me feel good. That makes me feel like, I mean, for me, violence has always been the least interesting part of a book, you know. I think, or the most, it's one of the least interesting parts of characterization, especially from a craft level, right? When we're talking about characters and we have characters involved in things. But, you know, I mean, my mentor was Larry Heinemann, who wrote one of the most maybe intense books on Vietnam. Great book called Paco's Story, that won the National Book Award in 1987. And the thing he always told me was, you know, it's always going to be a more satisfying draft if you tell the injustice, if you look into the injustice and tell it with the full authority of your voice and look those truths straight in the eye, because there's something jarring about, you know, and he said it was part of what makes Apocalypse Now or something like that, those movies, so terrifying, is like, it was the first time that that war, like the Vietnam War, for instance, was told in a way that was completely honest. You see that scene with the water buffalo and the knife going in, you're just like, holy smokes, it's surreal, it's bizarre. And there's a bit of that, you know, part of the research, I didn't get into this a little bit, but like, you know, going into the, you know, Praxedo de Guerrero, going to the Juarez Valley, and you see these towns that are like entirely burnt out. Or you go to places on the way to, like we had mentioned earlier, onto like in Coahuila, on the way to Sabinas, where I would go sometimes in the summers, and you like, what happened here? People say, oh, it's the cartel fought the military, but they were also fighting an auto defensa. And there was like a lot of different factions that were hollowing out these cities, and they looked like moonscapes or something. They looked like, there's a bit in the book where you talk about like these boulders in the middle of the road, and it was a way in which you could prevent cars from going into certain neighborhoods. That's where the safe homes were. And those truths, as you might know from just like living in Mexico and studying in Mexico, sometimes the images you can bring back are so beyond belief. They're like, what? I can't believe this exists. But I felt a real responsibility to like look that in the eye. So it was a real bifurcation of being at once repelled by them and once feeling like this is the least interesting part of the story. But it was also a landscape in which my characters operated within, right? This isn't the Condesa. This isn't like, the Roma Norte or something of the beautiful Mexico that maybe, I would like to write about. But this is where the rubber meets the road, and there's a kind of like almost a responsibility to address it, you know what I mean? But I'm really heartened by that student comment. It was a tough book to write. As you well know, it took years off my life. I'm sure it took like years off my life, but I'm glad I did it. I'm proud of it.
Daniel, what's next for you?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on a new book of nonfiction, actually, essays, called How to Look Away. And it's ironically about like, it's about what we need with other people's pain, right? When a car wreck happens, why do we slow down, right? When someone gets canceled on the internet, why does everyone pile on? And it's this sort of like dark impulse to sort of see other people. But I was like, what is that about? But the theory I have about it actually comes from Joseph Beuys. He has this concept called social structure, in which he believes everyone is an artist. And so I link art to citizenship. And I'm like, well, if everyone's an artist, the measure of citizenship within the United States is how fully you can articulate that. And I sort of linked that. I talked about mass shootings earlier, but the ways in which violence and state violence, or state-sponsored violence, or the violence that individuals decide to take upon one another in the American fabric, stymie that citizenship, have created this like two-tiered citizenship. So there are some people who are like more American than others, or who are allowed to be more of a person in the American schematic. And it was all the riff on this thing where my mom is like first gen, and she would always just tell me like, just be nice, don't get in trouble, play by the we're lucky to be here kind of thing. I was like, man, are we fully citizens? I think it comes from a really existential, like Chicano question, which is like, what am I? But yeah, that's the next book, How to Look Away. Yeah.
I have one final question. This is recorded, right? So other people are going to smile. If any aspiring writers are watching this, what advice would you give any aspiring writer that's trying to write a novel, trying to write an essay, poem, work of historical fiction, nonfiction? What advice would you give somebody at that stage?
That's a great question. The truth of it is like, we're not special. Like, we're really not that special. Like, go to the indie book festival. Just go to indie book festival and meet the writers, and you meet them, and you're like, these are just okay people. Like, these aren't, like, they're nothing that special. But the thing that separates, like, I think writers who publish versus I think people who do it more recreationally is that we just didn't stop. And I think that's the thing, is like, the most important ingredients to being a writer aren't being good. I can't tell you, Baldwin had this quote where he said, I can't tell you how many, great, incredible ruins I know. The most important thing is like, do you finish your work? Do you finish the drafts? And do you rewrite your drafts? That's all it takes. The great part about writing is you get infinite swings. If like this is baseball, you don't just get 3 swings, you get 70 or 80. Bang took like 8 drafts or something like that. And it's just okay, like you could get as many swings out as you want. And that's the beauty of it. We're nobody special. I really stand by that. Like, we're just people who just didn't stop. And you can be that too, just don't stop.
Awesome. I think we will open it up for questions from the audience.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks for that
Um,
conversation, by the way. That was awesome.
Yes, that was amazing. And I was definitely taking notes. I'm sure other folks were as well. So we did have a few questions get dropped into the chat. The first one was from Mr. Tesosomok. How do you differentiate between Mexican mercantilism versus American capitalism, hyper-transactionalism versus hyper-accumulation?
That's an interesting question. Sort of like a neoliberal economics question. For me, I mean, I'm interested in how, with this book, how, like I mentioned earlier, like when markets and armies go head to head, the market always wins. Something that's like a fundamental truth that I was really trying to articulate with Bang, and it's almost dumb to say it out loud, but like if you send an army after that cartel, for instance, what you do is you just make that commodity pricier because it costs more money for them to ship it, which in turn makes them more money. So it's like this vicious cycle of just like, you just make the end consumer, right, pays right in the end. And this is the same no matter what it is, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's videos you're downloading on a thumb drive, basic stuff from the Fayuca, whether it's I think is the most sensationalized, and a lot of that is problematic too in the American context because of the drug war. But I think we don't like to think of the black market and the actual market as integrated as part of the same market, but they are. And so for me, like, what role does Mexican mercantilism, American? I think of like just that is like, and also the truth that the black market exists on both sides of the. It's like not just Mexico. It's in the United States. It's in Europe. I mean, you're having stories. Vice had done a story not too long ago about like cartel happenings in like Norway and stuff. Like it's a truly global network. And to this end, true. I mean, I think about this too. If there's any hope in the book, and I talk about it a little bit, but the theaters, the sensationalization of the drug war. I mean, the theater were like the things that make the news. The drug war has always moved, right? It was at first in Colombia, and then you saw it bounce into the Caribbean. You saw, literally built the skyline of Miami, bounce into Central America, and then you see bounce into Mexico. It's going to bounce somewhere else eventually, right? So people think of this as like a uniquely Mexican problem, but I was like, no, this is a supply chain thing, right? And there's nothing uniquely Mexican about the drug war, about any of this stuff. And I think, I don't know, something I was truly trying to articulate, that there's a long trajectory. Some of the products, began obviously, and because of the sort of like proximity to the United States, obviously Mexico is going to be a player within that schematic. But this is a global market, and maybe that's the homework too, is to decentralize it. That is not just a Mexican problem. It's a black market problem. Some would argue that it's not even a problem. Like if you legalize these things, you take the power away from these cartels.
So that leads me to the next question, Daniel, which is the US is the primary market for illegal drugs. What changes for the cartels and Mexicans if we make drugs legal here and just take away the illegal market? So how will that affect the cartels and Mexicans?
I think you take a hit out of their pocket, but again, these cartels are so diversified now, where I think drugs are not even the main moneymaker anymore. Right now, the human trafficking, I think, as most people in Texas know, it's a real problem. I'm thinking of San Antonio, and just the other side of Lackman Air Force Base, there's migrants who were abandoned on basically in that trailer, right? We know that historically this has happened. We know that, that as we close down, but it really gets back to this. I don't know. I think about that aspect of the novel too, that I personally want to sort of that it still exists, is that U.S. immigration policy, the drug war in Mexico, and like they're reinforced. They're problems that we make it intentionally hard to get into this country. We feed bodies to this, and I still wonder sometimes if it's by design. It's a dark thought, but I think about that a lot. But yeah, I think they'll always exist in some form or fashion. They may not always be in Mexico. They may be in some other theater, but I think some facet of them will exist doing something. black market toothbrushes or whatever, you know.
I had a question for you, Daniel. How did you balance? So you obviously these geopolitical ideas and things that are happening, this historical context. How did you balance that with just, you also talked about people, just talking about people and their problems. How did you balance these large ideas, this historicity with the personal?
That's a great question. I mean, for me, it was always important to start in a scene and to end in a scene. Like, you know, I never like books that like lecture at a reader. Like they're like, let me tell you the story about NAFTA. And I would catch myself doing that, you know, and being like, putting on my professor tie and being like, I'm going to teach you some things. But for me, that's not a good reading, you know. I always tell my students, like The Lion King, we don't watch The Lion King because we like stories about lions that are kings. It's not like we're watching a documentary. We watch The Lion King because we want Simba to defeat Scar to become, you know, he's the Lion King or whatever, right? I'm always interested in how people get into conundrums and then get out of them. And for me, that's always going to win the day. You know, people and their problems, not problems and their people. But yeah, always on a craft level, always starting in a scene, always ending with that character in that scene, and making it focused on what do they want within the scene, even if only a glass of water, if only a cigarette, whatever.
Thank you. Let me see. So we don't have more questions, but there were some comments. So
Yeah.
Mr. De Sosomok said there is the same sense of impunity in the US with the last presidency. This comment was made when you were talking about the impunity of the Mexican government, people getting away with what minorities, when they were, you know, there was all this unrest and mistreatment of minorities. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was interesting to have read this or to have written this book in the sort of, it came out like during the Trump administration, in which like some of the worst policy, and I should say some of these policies are still extant, right? You know, you still see, I mean, some of the worst images of like the kids in cages, you know, like things happening on US soil to minors. I mean, it's horrifying. I mean, I guess I don't know what to say about it other than like it was just an underscoring of the fact that, like, you know, these systems, I think, are, and it was laid bare under the Trump administration, not only to strip dignity of people, and I think dignity was a core tenet of this novel, it was a meditation on dignity, but you can see geopolitically, it's such an abstract concept, like dignity. What is dignity? You know, it's, for me in a character, it's the impulse to move forward, the impulse to like almost like your human rights, right? But you can see when you strip dignity of someone, to use that as a geopolitical violence, I think is maybe one of the darkest things you can do to someone. I think it comes from the same place in the heart as killing them. And I think it's something that as a country we have to reflect on. And I think we haven't adequately reflected on it yet. We historically haven't reflected on it, you know, the Mexican American body and the place within the American fabric. I think it's troubling that a lot of those policies are still on the books, you know. But yeah, I think of those things like family separation. I'm looking at this one. Everyone is still dogmified by the alarma style jingoism, the voyeurisms of violence. I like this comment. Yeah, in the book, I was trying to sort of get at that a little bit with, there's a character, Ivan, who works for this magazine, like that's kind of alarma-esque. It's I forgot what the name is. It might even be alarma in the book. But it's to the end of like, it is a weird, those magazines have always struck me as kind of weird. But I'd love to hear more about this idea of like the jingoism and stuff. Yeah. Great comment. Other comments?
There was a question just posted. Do you feel there is a significant cultural appropriation of Latino stories by non-Latino writers in the US? Posted by Sammy.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, we have the most infamous one, which is American Dirt. And, you know, I think it's interesting how they want our stories, they want our food, but they don't want us, right? What's that about? I don't know. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around it. I think with that book, you know, I do believe every writer should write be able to write what they want to write. But I think that the trouble with that book was it reinforced so many mistruths about the drug war. You know, I think if you are writing to that. I mean, what rubbed me wrong is that like they're actual journalists and people we were kind of adjacent to, even when we were living in Mexico, who, I mean, I'm thinking like Nadia Vera, Ruben Espinoza, who were colleagues of Alfredo Corchado, who we met. I mean, they died reporting on this stuff and died reporting the facts, you know? The people who died reporting like actual stuff that they thought could change the course of how the war was going or how policy was going, and to reinforce some of the worst stereotypes and to undermine those messages felt like really dark in a way. But it felt it, and I know that wasn't the intent for American Dirt or anything like that, but I do think it was a kind of, I did wonder about the impulse behind it. Do they want the truth, or do they want a sort of like a sanitized version of our stories? Do they want it like Encanto? Like, is that what you know what I'm saying? What version of this do they want? And so I don't know. I do think there's an appetite for them. I do think we're in a dangerous moment in which, if they're too sanitized, this is my sort of warning with, and I talk about this with my agent a lot. There's a market demand for stories of brown joy and black joy, and I think they're worthy and I think they're good. But at the end of the day, I hope to write those one day, but I'm also not in the business of writing propaganda. You know, art that has a overt, like art that's moral. I don't think art should be moral. I don't think it should have morality. It should explore what it means to be human, and it should explore. I mean, the best stories are just person in a scenario and how do they get out of the scenario in a very subjective way. You know, for me, that's what a good painting is. That's what a good piece of literature is. It's not, and I think that was also the crime of American Dirt was it was dogma, right? It was propaganda in a way that I think was dangerous, actually.
By the way, and Dr. Pina, if you have any thoughts to share, I mean, absolutely, this is a conversation. So there was a follow-up question about the appropriation question, and it says, how do you look away with that situation if we have non-Latino writers taking Latino stories? Yeah,
I'm a huge believer of like, you can will your way. I mean, if you have a story to tell, you know, you should tell it. I don't care if it gets published or not, or if it's just a Twitter thread, or if you're just telling it to like to your abuelita. If you have a story and you know you have a story, you should absolutely positively put it in the world, however you can put it in the world. I think of publishing, like literature and publishing, as two separate animals. In fact, Coffee House Press has this, it's written in the front of every one of their books. Literature and publishing are different things. And so I think publishing is always going to be behind. I think publishing, much like the American fabric at large, is having a real hard time wrapping their mind around like even what Latino is, right? Like we know we're not a monolith, right? We know that, you know, Chicanos, you know, who identify as Chicano in Texas are different from those who identify as Tejanos, who Mexican Americans, and they, you know, forget the diaspora and that kind of stuff. And so I'm a huge fan of just like not thinking about it too hard. Just tell what you got to tell, and market be damned. And I think like the cream doesn't always float to the top. Like I have a good friend, you should check out his book, Joshua Stanislaw Lopez, published in the New Yorker twice. His book is coming out, the name escapes me right now. It's coming out with Copper Canyon Press, just came out. But, you know, I'm like, God, that guy deserves more love. You know, that guy deserves a tenure track position. That guy deserves like quite a bit more than he's getting, as do many other writers, you know, but at the end of the day, you can't make someone love you. We have to love ourselves, you know, and I think we tell your truth, you know, find your audience, and that's always enough. I think that'll always have to be enough for us. I don't know how to fix publishing, but I know that we can tell our stories, you know. Here's another one. To what extent do you as a Mexican American author identify with indigenous Mexican heritage, and how does that heritage influence your work? That's a great question. I just found out recently that I'm part Guadalupe. You know, you do those like 23andMe's or whatever, and I didn't do it actually. I'm afraid that they're going to take my DNA and they're going to grow up like they're going to make like another Daniel Pena, and then they're going to kill me, and then, you know, or whatever. And like the Beatles, like there's a second Paul or something. But yeah, I found I'm like part Huahuitecan, which is cool. I love, it's like, in a weird way, it's like I never left my homeland, which is cool, but I'm also embarrassed by it. I'm like, oh, you think we would have gone somewhere cooler? Like Oregon? Or I don't know, like we've been here for like millennia, which is kind of fun. Part Huahuitecan and part Comanche, which I was like, whoa, that's cool. You think of like Greater Comancheria, like, you know, that's like Kansas and stuff, coming all the way down into like Texas and stuff. And I was always fascinated with like the Comanche Wars and stuff. I grew up in North Austin, which was the site of like, I mean, if you want to read some really gnarly accounts of like indigenous battles with Texas Rangers that are like totally badass but scary, like just read up on all the shit that happened in North Austin. They would do these terrible things to settlers. It's really terrible. And again, I think violence is like the least interesting part of, but those stories are badass. I'm sorry. Like, they were like really interesting, but like they were these like, I mean, they were the kings of the plains and stuff like that. So I don't know. I don't feel like I have enough context to own those stories, but I'm proud of them. Like I'm proud of my indigenous heritage. Yeah. But I don't know what it means yet. I don't, like I've met people from the Huahuitecan tribe. They actually at the AWP in San Antonio, they were there. They did a dance before Elena Maria Viramontes' reading. And those are the guys, I met him and stuff. But I'm like, I don't know. All I have is the Wikipedia page and like a few people I know. I don't know that. But I'm really proud of it.
So we have about 5 more minutes. Any other questions that our audience may have for Daniel or even for Dr. Pina? You're muted, Dr. Pina. Oh, you can.
Uh-oh, am I the only one that's oh, it won't let you unmute. Hey, how about you type it and I'll do an impression of you. Could you do that? Just do it.
Can everyone hear me now?
Oh man, I thought I was gonna get to do an impression. Okay.
I really like that question that Sammy typed in. It's a difficult one, right? And I say this with my historian hat on. Indigenous peoples in Mexico have had a very particular history of violence, and a lot of these indigenous communities, many are still present, and they're still very much a fabric of Mexican society, usos y costumbres, and they're culturally, they're culturally important. I mean, not many people know, but there's about 60 something odd languages that are spoken in Mexico today. It's an extremely diverse country. And I think, heritage is one thing, but also conflating current identity and belonging to a particular community, that's the slippery slope right there, right? Just because of the violent history of the Mexican state and its relationship, for example, to the Yaqui, right, which it tried to exterminate them over the course of the 19th century. And the stories go on as well.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. You had me thinking of like the Tohono O'odham, who like split the borderlands with Arizona and northern Mexico, and how that's still a sort of like its own little geopolitical sort of like conundrum between the countries, between Texas. But yeah, they still play a role in everything.
Or even the Tarahumara, right, who managed to resist Spanish encroachment for much of the colonial.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. But yeah, it's a real shame. I feel like, I mean, it was part of colonialism. I mean, part of but also part of the like the Porfiriato. It's like we forgot, we were just like we had to forget our indigeneity almost by design in some way. I'm sure someone in my family knows more than I do. But again, that's sort of like part of the assimilation into it, sort of like the American fabric is like, no, that was a long time ago. You're American now, baseball, right, or whatever it is. Whataburger.
In and out is my.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can I just ask a real quick one?
Sure.
Are you thinking of another piece of like fiction after your?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just curious about that. Yeah.
I have a long novel that it's really been killing me, that I've been working on for years, but it's about actually the Mexican diaspora. So it's a guy who's Mexican Syrian, but like a lot of Syrians came to Mexico to sort of settle. I mean, that's where like pastor, some people think it came from that, like tacos al pastor. But there is a specific breed of apple that grows in Mexico that is not the Gros Michel, but I'm trying to think of the name of it. But anyways, it grows really good in the Golan Heights, and so it was brought back to the Golan Heights in the area between sort of Israel and Syria, and they would import it into Syria, and so it was sold like bananas. But it's a sort of diasporic family story about what happens to this family after the fallout of the Syrian civil war that takes place like recently, and then they go back to Mexico, almost like a reverse migration. So Mexican family, they went to Syria and then came back to Mexico, and he's struggling with sort of what it means to be sort of like Mexican. But then what ends up happening is obviously the COVID outbreak happens, and the short of it is he's a former fighter pilot for the Syrian regime, and so he's sort of like also messed up about some of the war crimes he's committed, and he's sworn off weaponized flight forever. And so it's a novel about flight. It's about the two theories of flight, which are the jet age, which is just like dumb brute power, just how fast can you go, and the thing people into flying, which are like kites, right? And it's this idea of sort of going back to this he inherits this plane from Alberto Braniff, who was the first Mexican pilot, and fixes it up and learns how to pilot basically a large kite through Mexico. And it's sort of a journey of him, meditation on war, meditation on migration, and flight in Mexico. And it's a really airy, kind of weird, it's kicking my ass. I can't finish it.
And it has apples in it.
It has apples in it, yeah.
No, it sounds great. No, this has just been such a great talk.
Thanks.
So
I appreciate it. It's easy when I have great facilitators. I got you, and I got Uli, and all the Florinda and everyone who showed up.
Yeah,
and Vince
thank
Cooper,
you
I
so
saw
much.
Vince Cooper, who is one of my favorite poets of all time. I see him. Thanks, Vince.
So it's 8:15, so that's all we have for tonight. But I just want to thank Daniel again and Dr. Pina. And I took lots of notes, so this was amazing. I want to thank everybody who joined us for joining us for this event. If you have a chance, please fill out the survey so you can let us know what you thought of the event. And yeah, that's it. Everybody have a great evening, and we will see you soon.
Thank you,
thanks
guys.
everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Yeah, it was great. It was great spending time with you, Daniel. Thanks so much.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me. Thank you.